Now that we have discussed all of the different processes that create landforms, we're going to move on to the environmental conditions that humans that live on the earth have to deal with. And one of the first things that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis is weather. And weather is the condition of the atmosphere at a particular location at a particular time. But what exactly causes our weather? Our weather is caused by several different things. Solar energy, so energy from the sun, water vapor, cloud cover, the types of landforms that you're nearby, or if you're nearby a body of water, because water heats and cools slowly, and land heats and cools quickly. It also depends on your elevation. As your elevation increases, the air becomes thinner and it's less able to hold moisture. Weather is also caused by air movement. Winds move air, solar energy, and moisture. Now, our precipitation depends on the amount of water vapor in the air at the moment and the movement of that air. And there's three different types of precipitation, or three different causes for precipitation. The first of which is frontal, and that is when cold, dense air pushes lighter, warm air upward, and that causes precipitation to form, as you can see in this image right here. Orographic or relief precipitation is the phenomenon that happens where rain falls on the windward side of hills or mountains and that block moist air and force it upwards. And then generally on the other side of the mountain, the leeward side of the mountain, there's usually, it's called a rain shadow. It's usually very dry and there's not very much precipitation. There's also convectional precipitation that occurs in hot or moist climates where heated air rises in the morning and by the afternoon clouds form and rain falls. This is generally what happens if people live by a large body of water or if you're in the rainforest. Now, our weather can become extreme because clashes between these air masses cause storms, and those storms can sometimes be severe. And when severe storms happen, it can cause major property damage and sometimes even loss of life. And some of the weather extremes that we experience here in the United States are hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, droughts, and floods. Now, while weather is something that is your weather conditions at a particular location over at a certain period of time, climate is our weather conditions at a particular location over a long period of time. Our climate is the trend of our weather. And there's a lot of factors that affect our climate. Wind currents impact our climate because hot air tends to flow toward the poles and cold air tends to move toward the equator. And all of that is at an angle due to the curvature of the earth. Our ocean currents, we have warm water that flows away from the equator. Cold water flows away from the poles, and that also can cause precipitation. So the warmth of the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic drift help to keep the temperature of Europe pretty moderate, even though Europe is as far north as Canada, which is pretty cold. Cold ocean currents chill the air and prevent moisture from falling. So people who live near cold ocean currents tend to have very dry, cool temperatures. Our zone of latitude also impacts our climate. We tend to have tropical climates in the low latitudes, polar zones, cold areas in the high latitudes, and then in between the low and high latitudes we have temperate or seasonal climate that would be similar to what we experience here in central Illinois. Your elevation also impacts your climate because as your altitude increases, the temperature decreases. So even if you are living in a tropical zone, if you're living in an area that has high elevation, even though you're in a tropical zone that tends to have warmer temperatures, because of your high altitude, you'll tend to have lower temperatures. And our topography also impacts the climate that we have. Moisture-filled winds cool as they move up the side of mountains, releasing rain or snow, and by the time winds reach the other side, they're dry and become warmer as they flow down the mountain. This is the same phenomenon as the orographic or relief precipitation on the previous slide. Now, our world is broken down into 12 different climate zones, as you can see on this map provided on this slide, between tropical wet and dry, semi-arid, arid, Mediterranean, humid subtropical, subarctic tundra, and highlands, and humid continental. And we live in a humid continental climate region, and you'll learn more about the climate regions with activities in class. Now, our vegetation regions are also decided by our weather and climate. There's a lot of influences on the type of vegetation, things like soil type, temperature, and moisture. So that temperature and moisture is very much tied into our weather and climate. And our world's food supply depends greatly on soil, and it determines what type of vegetation is going to be supported in a region. So that in turn influences what type of human activities are able to take place in that region. So we have 4 main biomes that break down into 10 vegetation regions. And these vegetation regions set the stage for human activities. It determines areas that would be good for farming versus raising livestock versus producing timber or forest areas. And those vegetation patterns are identified on the basis of the ecosystem that they support. And the ecosystem of a region is called a biome. So the first biome is a forest, and forests are categorized by the type of trees that they support. So tropical rainforests are entirely deciduous. So deciduous trees have broad, flat leaves, and the big important thing about a deciduous tree is deciduous trees drop their leaves seasonally. So a lot of the trees that you see in this region in central Illinois are deciduous trees because they lose their leaves in the fall and winter. Now, tropical rainforests that are entirely deciduous are almost entirely in the northern hemisphere and mainly in the tropics to the mid-latitudes. We also have coniferous forests, which tend to occur in the northern regions of North America, Asia, and Europe. And these are far north. Entirely coniferous forests are all needle leaf. They have the small needle-like pokey leaves that retain their needles year-round. So think about pine trees, fir trees, cedar trees, trees that we use for our Christmas trees that don't lose their leaves. And then in the mid-latitudes, what we have here in central Illinois is deciduous or mixed forests. So we see both deciduous and coniferous trees here in central Illinois. Another main type of biome is a grassland, and grasslands are flat regions that are dotted with a few trees, and they tend to be called different things depending on where you are. Tropical grasslands are usually called savannas. They are flat, grassy, and they are mostly treeless. The Serengeti in Africa is a tropical savanna. The temperate grasslands, so that would be mid-latitudes, are called steppes and prairies. In Europe and Asia, they call those prairies steppes. Here in North America, we call those areas prairies. And then in the southern hemisphere, those temperate grasslands are called pampas. Another biome is a desert, and deserts generally have plants that are specifically adapted to tolerate dry and or cold conditions. And tundras are very similar to deserts in that plants, they're also specifically adapted to tolerate dry and cold conditions. In the tundra, plants are generally really close to the ground. They tend to hug the ground. You don't see a lot of upgrowth from those plants. Things like mosses or lichen thrive in the tundra. And in the desert, you have plants that can conserve water and withstand the heat. So if we think about cacti, sagebrush, or those tiny desert shrubs. And you can see some of those shrubs here in this picture, and then you can see the mosses and lichen here on the rocks and ground in the tundra. This map shows all of the vegetation regions as they exist on the Earth's surface, and you can see using the legend here that we are in kind of right on the border between the prairie and deciduous forests. And you can see how these connect to climate regions with some activities that we'll do in class.